and welcome to Our People, the podcast where we give space for Holdeman stories. We focus on hope, healing, and inspiration. Connection, consciousness, and love are the driving motivations for this project. Remember to have grace for those who have chosen to speak out and share their experience. Please enjoy the story you will hear today.
Good morning. This is Amanda, and today I am your host with Billy, and we have Mary Byler on with us. So,
Welcome here, Mary.
yes.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, right off, so Mary, tell us a little bit, like what are you all involved with as far as helping people deconstruct? Would that be kind of like what's your life's mission, so to speak?
Well, I actually founded an organization called the Misfit Amish where we host a podcast and we have created resources for people who are coming out of plain dressing communities so that people know more, both within the communities and both external to the communities. They can learn more about how to appropriately serve the victims of crimes within those communities. We're also
Okay,
involved in research and we publish blog posts for people who are interested in doing so.
very good. Okay.
And later this year, we have another presentation for a child advocacy center to talk about specifically how they can better serve victims of crimes that might come across their in their capacity. They might be able to serve those victims better.
That is amazing.
Well, and so I think part of the reason why we wanted to invite you on, you're obviously not a Holdeman Mennonite, or you didn't grow up with Holdeman Mennonites. So as our first non-Holdeman guest, what do you think it was that drew us to ask you to come on and talk about our topic today, which has many names, but the general most common name that that is not a Holdemanese term would be shunning, or as Holdemans like to say, the avoidance of the expelled. Yeah, like why do you think we asked you here?
Well, Billy, because I know a little tiny bit about shunning. Despite being assigned a female at birth, despite being born into an Amish community, despite being raised to believe that I could not possibly grasp or comprehend the Bible, would it shock you to think that I have done a lot of work to dismantle what shunning is, how it was enacted against me, how I've seen it being enacted against other people, and what some of those consequences are? Would that shock you?
I don't know, if I was kind of like a sheltered person who didn't know that much about women's ability to think outside the box, I might be a little frightened. But I'm, I'm glad to say I've hopefully have gotten a little further beyond that. Um, and and I think to our guests that we've had on our podcast through this first season have been really helpful in helping us understand just the whole scope of the experience from a variety of demographic points of view. And I think that our knowledge is gained by hearing what people have to say. People who are witnesses to things but aren't necessarily a part of them sometimes can have an interesting point of view, especially about topics like this. And also for people who have exercised a certain amount of influence, and especially in spaces where they never would have been given any of that influence when within the context of the church group they're coming from. And so I think that's part of what has helped us be change makers, is that a lot of the people who have had their voice taken, or some people were just from a position within the church where their station was silence. And so giving people that opportunity to contribute to the conversation is something valuable to me. And I think it's something that's really helped us. Um, not only with people telling their stories and the benefits of that to them, but also for people who can listen in um, and get thinking. Because at the end of the day, we all had to have a point where something new reached us through the void and got us thinking. And thinking is dangerous because you start going somewhere new. And that's scary, whether or not you're coming from an insular religious group, but it's something that you're going to have to work through. It's going to be difficult, but there's going to be a lot of growth and there's going to be a lot learned. And it's also something that you can choose to share with other people.
Yeah, you absolutely can. But why did you really invite me, Billy? What was your brilliant idea here?
Well, so I think what really got me thinking about you was you have done such a good job of capturing the dynamics of the social construct of shunning. You have been within your work a very outspoken rebel against it, and also calling it out for what it is. It is abusive, it's bullying at best, and it's something that ultimately does not gain spiritual benefit for anybody involved, despite what others might say. So, since this podcast comes from a Holdeman Mennonite lens, I guess kind of what we're thinking is we'll start with observing the construct from their point of view, let them have the first word, and then we can kind of dissect that piece by piece, talk about how we see it expressed in other circles, perhaps, and talk about some of the ways that I try to be forward thinking with things. It's like, what are the ways that you can deal with people who decide they want to hold some sort of stigma against you or social control? How do you handle that when it's happening to you? And also, how might you inspire people to make different choices when it comes to how they treat people who might not be feeling the same way about the faith that they have, and decide something's better for them than what they were taught.
Yeah, well,
So
I think we should do that. I mean, to my best understanding, the Holdemans were started with John Holdeman, and he didn't believe there. What did it have to do? Why did he leave? Why did he start the Holdemans?
well, there are a lot of things, but a big part of it was concern over children. Didn't seem like children were getting trained well enough. Child training involves a lot of spanking and some other practices that help break their will. So that's really important, because otherwise, how are we going to keep people in the church if they don't grow up afraid? So that's one thing. Can you tell I have some feelings about that? Uh,
You have feelings?
so
I can't
so
imagine why. Why would you have
no.
feelings about that?
So that's one thing. There was also some concern that within the Mennonite church, there were not enough people holding the avoidance in such a way that it would cause people to turn back. And so from John Holdeman on, there's been, even within the Holdeman church, some varying degrees with which this practice is carried out and the way it is. Sometimes we find ways to make exceptions that feel a little bit better to us, but ultimately the construct is the same no matter what. The whole point is basically a ball of shame needs to come down on somebody. And so from their point of view, um, Church of God in Christ Mennonite publishes a wonderful book. It's almost 500 pages of what they call Bible doctrine and practice. And basically, it's kind of a manual for people who want to get it right. As you can imagine, we're not people who are making rules, so there's nothing very concrete. It's just enough so you know, like, how to follow the social cues. But this one is pretty clear, because excommunicated people, according to them, should be avoided in all spiritual fellowship. And it talks about a bunch of other doctrines that should be not exercised around excommunicated people, but it doesn't give scriptural references to how those things are connected. It just says them. But um, a lot of it concerns both guarding the church, guarding individual people's peace and their spiritual integrity, I guess one might say. And the point ultimately is that people who are staying within the goodwill of the church are going to exercise this form of social control in a way that reminds apostates of their fallen condition and their severed fellowship with God and the church, that this is a relationship that's broken on earth and in eternity unless someone repents. And then there's also the concern that these apostates, through their disobedience, might defile the church members if they aren't willing to turn away from them. And it goes on for 3 or 4 pages describing how the avoidance should be kept, some scenarios that might come up, like eating at funerals, or if you have a guest over, social matters, what to do about secular things that deal with expelled people, and then also what might happen if we don't hold the avoidance. They are concerned that it diminishes the effectiveness of excommunication in the first place if you don't hold the avoidance. In fact, it will render it useless. So what they're saying is if people are expelled from the church, whatever the reason, we'll never get them to come back unless we hold the avoidance. Because we should stand in judgment of his condition and then continue to associate with him as before. Well, duh, of course, that's not going to help him see he's terrible. So basically, anyone who they ended up with, anyone who is so weak as not to be able to hold the avoidance might as well be expelled too, is basically what it boils down to. Now, that's a very Cliff Notes version of it, but basically, you're supposed to just kind of turn away from them, not give them much. Your only association should be, hey, let's get back in the good grace of the group. What is it going to take for you to have an experience tonight and get reaccepted tomorrow? I mean, that's just kind of what it comes down to. Um,
Well,
so
do
yeah, I don't.
so you describe the charismatic leader, which would be, John Holdeman. He had he was the charismatic leader because he had the authority given to him, the transcendental mission. And I'm working off of a list of toxic groups by Daniela Messinek Young, by the way. You have the transcendental mission because you're talking about this higher goal of raising the children properly. You have the us versus them mentality, a distinct separation from people who are part of the group and people who are not part of the group. You have high exit costs. Because if people are excommunicated and then they are practicing social avoidance against them, and they are being told if they can and cannot eat with them, that's a very high exit cost. And then they even incorporate the ends justify the means mentality, which makes me wonder, do they also limit access to the outside world? Because you mentioned something about how to handle the secular events. Do they limit that access? And do they exploit members' labors? And do they expect self-sacrifice from members? Just things to think about in regards to the group as a whole. But going back to the avoidance, so where you said that they practice this whole, it's presented, the way that it's presented as, sounds to me like it's presented as something that is for the greater good. Now, how does that play out in the scenarios they gave? Like, what kind of scenarios did they give you?
Well, the one of the first scenarios was related to meals. So let me find exactly what we said here. So one example that they gave was gatherings, public church or school functions that are frequently attended by excommunicated people. So the whole point is not to become mixed up. A lot of it is they want a very clear distinction between those who are and who aren't excommunicated. And when we have the atmosphere of a gathering that doesn't reprove the expelled ones, we don't have any way to entreat them to reconsider their ways. I think a lot of it is you have to shut your mind off. I mean, to me, it's prescribed to you that there is no other way that you can make them turn around than to hold the avoidance. Because the biggest question that I've gotten from people who have nothing to do with Mennonite world at all, this is a new thing to them. They're like, well, why not take somebody a cup of coffee and have a chat? Or why not ask questions? Why not go? Because here's the thing. I have learned a lesson here because I used to think, well, they're just going to talk to me and they're going to convince me that they're right and I'm going to be deceived. Have you ever considered that maybe that deception is your mind opening to information that you before would ignore because it would interfere with your ability to keep this worldview? I mean, that's where it basically comes down to. Because if you invite guests to a home meal where there's going to be expelled people, you should have a separate setting provided for them. However, it should not be
Oh,
purely social and temporal conversation because that's not going to draw the prodigal. You should have a conviction to invite them for a meal in the first place. And if you're just inviting them over for the purpose of holding the avoidance, that's not charitable. So it says like we don't want to try to do this. I mean, this is something that is just so painful and it should hurt that we're doing this. So the other part of it is the reverse. It's not supposed to feel good. If you feel good about this, that's a problem. But if you feel bad about it, good. You're supposed to feel bad. You're watching them floundering in worldly ways.
are you also being holy by enacting
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm not getting defiled before communion.
that? You're not getting led astray by an apostate like me. Look, I feel like you might have been led astray a little bit.
I don't know. I mean, I've been talking with Amanda for a while, and we've been talking to a lot of expelled people lately. I don't know. It's interesting to me how just how many, I mean, maybe that's what's wrong with me. I've been just talking to too many expelled people. But here's my question. The thing that's interesting to me is outside of the walls of the church, there are no expelled people. Yet there are good people and bad people. You hear those stories that especially middle to upper aged white guys want to get up and share in front of church in tears about how that cashier at the supermarket, she said just the most beautiful things, and I could just see her spirit was so good, and it's amazing and it's inspiring that the world is just isn't just, not everyone out there is just as wicked as can be. And it's like, okay, so my question is, why are we placing these different value levels on people who we don't know, who know nothing about the closed world of doctrine we have, but yet people within, if you know the system and you don't comply, that's where the breakdown happens. And so um, it's just interesting to me how these things get related to church membership when humanity doesn't recognize that. I mean, I understand within the social construct of a social construct of a one true church place where their doctrine is very insular and avoiding worldliness, but also avoiding people who decided that the world isn't so bad. It's like, okay, at what point does that hunkering down help us benefit or grow? I mean, that's what it kind of came down for me, um, comparing that. I'm rambling a bit, but yeah, I
I
mean, that's just kind of what I reflect on is how,
I always enjoy your thoughts, Billy.
yeah.
I think the shunning for me, I always find it so entertaining that it's like the same similar doctrine, ideology, whatever you want to call it, but then insular groups who happen to be high control often use specific vernacular because that word, that they're trained, they're conditioning their members to respond this way. Oh, you see somebody who is cast out. You see somebody who has now been othered, even though they were formerly in the good graces of the group. They are trained to respond to that person. Guckerschmull. Just look at them. You know, they are apostates. They are Abgangni. They are non-believers. They are people from the secular world. They are worldly people. All of that is indicative of that us versus them mentality. But then the training that's invoked through you said there's multiple pages of this doctrine.
Well, and this also isn't the only book that's talking about it too. I mean, we were just talking before you came on about Doctrine class studies book. What else? Conference reports. Um, what's that other great book
It is
called? I can't even
utterly
remember.
fascinating
I
that
have a whole
some
bookshelf of
people
Holdeman books.
that people have went to that level to define how they're not really shunning, but they are shunning. You know, because let's go back to the definition of shunning. What is the definition of shunning? Do you know what it is?
I'm not well acquainted with Merriam-Webster, I'm afraid.
Well, I'll tell you what Merriam-Webster says. To avoid deliberately and especially habitually. Mandated shunning is a group mandated shunning. It's the group norm. It's expected if you are to maintain your membership in the group.
So you're
So,
saying that like this doesn't have anything to do with faith. It doesn't. There's some supposed ties, but like Jesus wasn't trying to keep people following him as hard as he could, and then if they decided they weren't really interested in continuing, that he just like kicked them to the curb.
I mean, let's really consider the Last Supper. I mean, let's really consider the life of Jesus. And I might offend a few people. I apologize in advance. But let's consider a man who walked around in robes with a dozen of his best friends, and one of them betrayed him, and he still didn't kick him out. Like, can we just have a moment for that?
So you're saying like the first instances at the birth of the church, there was somebody like that, and Jesus didn't just like get him taken care of right away, like see you later. They didn't have an inquiry. They didn't have to go to meetings with all the rest of the disciples to discern like what punishment was coming. They just said, oh, that's too bad, and went forward and continued growing and seeing what happened. And you know what's interesting? The church continued on, and there's still a church today, and there's many people who think they've got it figured out, but not quite. I'm not quite sure if we do, but I mean, what you're saying is an interesting point because with that logic, there's a lot of things that probably just would not have transpired and happened. We may not even be here talking about this today if it would have been different. But Jesus didn't do anything like this. I mean,
I mean,
and
he
if we're
chased the
if we're
money changers out of the temple, but those were the people that were defrauding people.
yeah,
Like,
they weren't members they weren't members, were they? They were just
they were just
citizens working
who were
working for the
defrauding
government.
people. Like,
Oh,
that's all
okay.
that was. Like, can
But
we?
but but there aren't any people in the church who are good, faithful members doing that to people either. Um, so
I mean, but
so at
Judas,
this point, so from a start, we've already like kind of said, okay, the shallow biblical interpretation starting to fall apart. Okay, we're getting a little deeper now. Okay, so I guess what really is gained by this practice? I mean, who is benefiting from this practice if it's not just simply a protection mechanism for the group? How does it benefit the expelled person, and how is it benefiting people who are still in the group?
well, one, it allows them to maintain their status within the group. to maintain whatever level of privilege because they are complying with the expectation. Two, it also tears apart families. But ultimately, it's giving power to whoever is in charge of them. It's giving authority to them. It's giving authority to the charismatic leader, whichever leader that is. If the leader is like the leader of your local congregation, or it's the leader of the entire Holdeman church, I don't know how you all are structured exactly, but whomever is in charge. It's giving authority to them being able to have the power to tear apart families, to cause great harm to people who deeply love each other. It's also teaching people that to love someone is to shun them, isn't it? Because they're not being compliant with the doctrine. To love someone is to shun them. So it's kind of transactional in nature. And that is part of why it tears apart families, because it's telling parents to love your child, you must break their will. To love your child, even your adult children who perhaps become non-practicing, they're no longer members of the church. Now they're telling the parents that in order to love their children appropriately and remain in good standing with the church and not lose so much privilege and not lose status and not lose benefits, because people can even lose access to resources. People can also be potentially publicly shamed. I don't know if Holdeman's practice this, but some people have people who don't uphold shunning properly get up in front of the entire congregation and get on their knees and confess. Sometimes people are disciplined by a period of shunning by itself because they're not upholding the shunning policy properly. So how do the Holdemans do it? I don't know. I wasn't a Holdeman.
Well,
Loss.
Amanda, what do you have to say?
So loss of jobs. I have known several people, or boys, men that worked with their fathers that they left the church. The boys left the church or whatever, and the fathers told them that if you don't get back in the church by, let's say, a time frame, then you will have to you can no longer work for me. And they were pretty much like contracted in. They're doing their own work, but the dad would have been, and they lost. Yeah, so they either got in or they lost that. And I've known it go both ways. Some of them got it back in, and others lost that livelihood and branched out on their own.
Mm-hmm. And another thing is people can lose housing. They can lose access to schooling for their children.
That whole avoidance children. Okay, so it's caught, not taught, correct? That if you are not a member, you are less than. So my husband has a son from his first marriage, and they sent him to Mennonite school. That boy has absolutely no respect for his father or his mother. And from observing, it looks as if that's where it came from. His father and his mother were, the one was never a Mennonite, but the other, but his father had been and then left. And this congregation is really, really good at holding their, love for avoidance. And so, why did he have to listen to them? They were less than, they were nothing. And so, when my husband's mother kept inviting our girls to go to Bible school with them. I've got great memories of Bible school. I love Bible school. We loved Bible school. It was fun. But I finally told my husband, you need to go have that talk with her because, we are not sending for a reason. We're not just not doing it because we don't like them. We'd love them to be able to go, but because of that avoidance and how it is looked upon that we are less than or, not up to par, then so he went and had that talk and his mom's like, we never think said that. And he's like, Mom, you've never said it, but it's caught because I have learned that. I learned that growing up. I knew that somebody that was expelled was less than. They weren't, you didn't have to bother with them or mess with them or pay attention to them because they were no longer up to snuff. He said, we're not going to put our children in that environment. He says, and I believe the biggest mistake I made with my son was the biggest like disservice I did to him was putting him in an environment where he had to basically choose between what he was learning with all his friends and everybody there and versus his parents. So there's a lot of things. It affects a lot.
That's really, really awful. And furthermore, like, children are vulnerable. And even if, like, people often forget this, but as a parent myself, I can't imagine. I just can't imagine. But also, children, you can say things, but your actions are what children will reenact. So if you're sitting there and being a bully to somebody or othering somebody, but you're saying we're doing it because we love them, but children are smart enough to pick up on that, are those children then going to repeat their verbal love, or are they going to copy your actions?
Actions, it's caught, not taught.
I think for me, one thing that I remember thinking in one particular case, there was a particular person who what they were up to was discovered, and I won't say a lot of details because I don't want to demonize anybody or call anyone out, but this particular person got caught in what they were doing and were expelled, and then everyone started treating them as no. Now, it's not as like, to me, I don't feel like I knew this person that well. And so the fact that for some time beforehand, I already had concerns, because for me, I still believe in the avoidance to an extent, but not in the same context. Someone who is absolutely toxic, harming other people with their behavior, yes, avoid that. And that doesn't mean saying, I'm not going to have lunch with you. It means I'm not going to let you infiltrate my energy here. Okay. That's called boundaries. This is not boundary setting. This is slaying other people socially. So there's a difference. So this person, I had already started avoiding them. I just kind of was just like, he's lost it and I don't get it. And I have inquired enough to know that this person is not interested in changing what their viewpoint is and their behavior. So then at that point, I just kind of checked out. And for me, that just means I'm just not making overtures towards you. But then seeing what happened once they were finally expelled and how everyone treated them, how quickly they were reaccepted and how quickly that all reversed is what was one of many points along the way where something clicked for me. It's like, okay, there's something else at work here. This isn't doing what it's supposedly designed to do, because social controls are important. We have means of carrying out justice when people are wronged in society. And while no, those aren't of the church, they are an example of social constructs which are for the greater good and for the protection of others. That doesn't mean that we have to break doctrinal concerns about violence, participating in harming others for the sake of greater good, because those aren't means that have to be there. It's interesting to me how Anabaptist groups that landed in North America and specifically the United States have a far different interpretation and action of these doctrines than European Mennonites ever did, and even today don't carry the same way. And so it's interesting to see how all of that evolved, because this and amongst myriad doctrines and how they are practiced now by the Holdemans and other groups, these things would have never happened in other countries. And it's interesting how all of these high control groups with similar practice and doctrines are only either in the United States or other places which permit those kind of social behaviors from a place of supposed religious freedom.
I'm gonna interrupt. It's not that they're only in the United States. They're in other countries too, some of them. Maybe Anabaptist is specifically the United States or American or North America groups that are practicing this so heavily and so strictly. But for example, there was recently a case where I believe it was in Norway where they revoked the tax exempt status of Jehovah's Witnesses, or was it Amsterdam? You got to look up the stop
Yeah.
mandated shunning policy, and you got to look into those cases so you can understand perhaps like some of the broader implications. But another thing that can happen is when people report crimes to church ministry, sometimes specific types of Anabaptists, like they're enacting the shunning towards the victims of the crimes.
Mhm.
And
Why do you think that is?
specifically because victims of the crimes reported the crimes, or because they're speaking out against abuse. Well, it's very helpful when groups who are high control and patriarchal and authoritarian in nature have the capacity of threatening somebody or harassing somebody to the point that they no longer wish to be alive. There are people that die by suicide largely because of shunning.
Mhm.
And we need to remember that.
Yeah.
And we need to also remember that when they enact shunning against victims, it's usually done because the narrative that the church has told about the crimes that were committed do not benefit the group. So in order to attempt to wrestle back control and get this person back under control, back under the fold, back into compliance, back into the only righteous holy way, they pull out all the stops.
Mhm. So to me, it's interesting to see how far they do go. Because I would say, I mean, if we took an inventory of our podcast guests here since we started, and how many of them reported family separation happening, further abuse, alienation, loss of resource. I mean, you name it. And I've seen a lot of that too. I have seen people within the Holdeman Church committing suicide because of what they experienced and the behaviors against them. I've seen people lose their jobs, seen people lose housing. Um, I've seen a lot of these things. And one thing that is interesting to me is how people who are close to the expelled are so committed. You know, they could lose their child to this very thing, and yet they cannot turn away. I mean, that's another part of it too, is the psychology of this mindset and being able to carry it out. It's violence, really. um Anabaptist people are very good at saying we aren't violent, but they don't understand that violence isn't exclusively reserved for shooting, punching, and going to war. Social violence is oftentimes way more devastating because it doesn't leave a physical mark, which doesn't look good, because we know that within these groups, their image to the outside is so important. I was just up in Jamesport yesterday with Michael and met with somebody who lives in a town populated by Holdemans. And it was interesting to hear some of what they had to say. And she was talking about, we are struggling with our church membership, and they're over there and they have 130 people at church on Sunday compared to us. And I said, yeah, and they're all afraid.
Um, you know, you mentioned being afraid in the church membership. Have you ever known of people being afraid of being sent off to mental health facilities or being labeled or demonized within the group or even like told, oh, you're mentally ill, you know? I've seen this happen with groups where they, and this is by and large very conservative groups, but by and large what they do is they will appoint a committee of men over the members. They will tell the members, we're going to rehome your children because this committee of men has decided what they're going to do. And then they will send the couple off to a facility for, and let me be very, very clear, these are unqualified facilities. Like they are unlicensed and unqualified. And when I
Oh,
say
so
they're
like
unlicensed,
you're
they
saying that like people like Jeanette Harder got involved with some of them and recommended them too? I mean, I thought she was a licensed clinical social worker.
Oh, but she recommended Whispering Hope, which we have on court record as a deacon, an Amish deacon, testifying that he was ordained by lot, and that's what qualified him to do sex offender rehabilitation.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that people sometimes
And
they're met with a choice. Okay, you can go here or be expelled. That's another thing. I mean,
or we're
and
going to take your
yeah.
children from you. And
Oh,
then
okay.
can we also, I'm not talking about Dr. Jeanette Harder, and I am using doctor loosely, but I am saying that people who recommend facilities like that, people who recommend resources like To a Girl of 11 as preventative aid for parents to teach their children to prevent CSA, they are legitimizing the systemic the structures of the systemic oppression that plain people have faced, and they're positioning themselves as heroes and rescuers and saviors to do so, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And they're further giving the church even more authority.
So, and this brings up a very important point. I mentioned a little bit before about how the locale of a group and where it exercises its control has a lot to do with whether that control continues. When you think about other countries or even certain states within the United States who don't have Holdeman congregations, or sometimes it's not even necessarily a state, but how far out of town you are. Do you think that has anything to do with how these practices continue despite many people who, if they recognized what was happening, probably wouldn't accept it? I mean, what do you think that says about both the groups, but also the society that encircles them?
Well, I think that on some level, the people that are within the group, do they recognize that they are part of a group that holds doctrine and theology and ideology that is actively harmful and violent to other people? Do they
Mhm.
recognize that this doctrine and theology, this ideology, has enabled literally harming people, harassing people, treating people as other, never quite enough, putting up moving goalposts that they can never meet, to the point that people literally die by suicide, and that makes me wonder if it could be considered murder. Do they
Mhm.
recognize that they are upholding that? Are they working against that narrative about the doctrine? Are they considering the actual impact of the doctrine? Is it effectively rehabilitating the person that is being disciplined by this manner?
Mhm.
Does it
I guess
create
it
meaningful
depends.
change?
It depends on your point of view. I mean, if that young person, goes from being a godless teenager who went bowling, for example, um, and it was even after 11 p.m. I mean, just some of the stuff I've heard recently where people look back and they, are so disappointed in themselves because they did something like that as a teenager. It says a lot about what's happening to them, and how people have treated them, how they've responded to them as they grow and learn as a person. There's just so much that even I, up until a couple of years ago, I was just so absolutely naive. I had no idea. Um, and and I also recognize I had a lot of benefit compared to some others because I was physically taken away from the church for a couple of periods in my childhood, because my mother stood up to them and said, "No, you're not taking my child away again."
Good
Things
for
like
her.
that.
Go
Um,
Billy's mom.
like looking back now, I have a whole different picture for my mother than I did when she was alive because I didn't look at her through the lens that they told me to. And I remember when she would say things like, they're trying to take you from me, or I did everything I could to get you out of that church, and yet you go back. Like hearing those words and the fact that that said nothing to me, it did not mean anything to me because I was so invested in that and so deep in it. It, I mean, from the beginning, it is just so, I mean, to me, it's it's hard to call it abusive in one sense because everybody, almost everybody except for a few people, and there are some specific people and specific ministers in that church who I know have their eyes open and are in full control of their behavior and are doing it. I know it. There's enough of them in there, and when I hear their voices, there's even one of them, he sounds just like Warren Jeffs from the FLDS, and I cringe every time I hear him. Maybe Amanda knows who I'm talking about, but anyway, just the fact that people are so obedient and willing to joyfully do this to their own family. Like even myself as a child, I was willing to wrestle myself physically away from my mother so that way I would not be with her. And I want to be fully transparent that my mother was not perfect. She was not living in a way that was going to be helpful to me in my growth as a human. Like she wasn't doing everything right either, but she wasn't brainwashing me. She was pointing me towards learning and options and um, self
Autonomy.
decision making, autonomy, and also even despite all of this and how she felt, still respected my choices and was okay with me seeking to stay with the church. She still accepted that, still treated me kindly. There were hard times. There was a time where I didn't talk to her for 5 years because I just I think deep down I think she was starting to get to me, and it was kind of that kind of thing. But thinking about how all of that was, and I don't know how many times I had a visit with the staff, and all they wanted to talk about is, how things were with my mother and whether my mother was finding her way with the Lord and all this stuff. And it was just so frustrating to me because it's like, well, if I'm supposed to be avoiding her, I'm not going to have much contact with her. Why don't you all try to go have a meeting with her? Like that was another thing that was interesting to me is they weren't
That's a
willing to go do the talking either. But
that's a
I don't know.
very interesting dichotomy. You're practicing the avoidance the way they taught you should do. But then you're in trouble and you're being counseled because, Billy, why are you not leading her to the Lord?
That I never thought of it that way, but it's
Why?
interesting. It's interesting that that's there, and there is just so much, or like people wanting to know, exactly, which relatives were which, and which people were members of were our people and which people, because like even my mother in her young days was not with the Holdeman Church because her mother left, and her mother didn't come from it. She joined in later. And so I mean there's several layers going on there, but it's interesting to me how there was so much concern about that, especially people who had died already. Like even my mother, people would still ask me questions about her and I'm like, she's dead. She's been gone now. What does this have to do with me and my station with anything with the Lord or anything? There's just everything's like that. But what that tells me now, because you cannot be concerned about the spiritual welfare of someone in relation to their relationship to somebody who is not God, who is not living on the planet with us, and not then by that very act confess that this has nothing to do with spiritual things, in my opinion. Those relationships that I had with other fellow humans and needing to know details about them and how they felt and what they were doing and yada yada yada, any of it. I mean, to me, say we're all in that congregation together and we're all, that was a situation, sure. But it's like my mother was living an hour away. I had siblings and they all live all over the place, and none of it had anything to do with me because I was the last one standing, basically, that didn't leave, I mean, Christianity overall, a lot of them. But yeah, it's interesting to me looking back. It's like, okay, why were these questions? Why, when the revivalists came, was this the topic of discussion when you came to visit me? Um, and there were other things they'd wanted to discuss and things they had to say and whatever, um, but talking about people who were no longer with the church, what did that have to do with anything there? I mean, that tells me that there's some sort of social manipulation going on. There's other desires for information. There's a desire for gossip material. I mean, there's so many other things, because what's interesting to me is all of those topics became very popular with everyone else at church, and I never said anything about them.
Well, what if often knowledge is power within insular groups, and they're controlling information also by controlling the gossip?
Because that's all they really have when it comes down to it. I learned that from Amanda. When it comes down to it, unless there's gossip, they don't have anything to talk about. And I noticed that even I went back to my home area here a couple of weekends ago, and I had not been back since I had moved away. And the questions I got and the things people had heard about what I was been up to were interesting. Like,
Oh,
I was interested in
Billy.
this gossip because it was news to me. And
Please
it's
tell
so
me
interesting how
about
often that
you.
happens.
I love learning about myself from people who haven't talked to me in 20 years. So please tell me about you.
Well,
I want to hear this. I'm nosy.
I I'm trying to remember what was one of the most interesting. I had gotten involved with some new strange church. There were some people who thought that I had joined the church up in Indiana at a different congregation and just kind of saw my way, like different things people had asked me, and I was like, no, I never, like, the closest I got to Northern Indiana congregation was driving by on my way to work. And the only thing I remember is this is a small congregation compared to what I'm used to, and their sign was very hard to read. Not that it was like falling down, but it was just very poorly designed. And me as a communications and graphic design person, I'm just like, they could have done so much better. I've seen better Holdeman church signs.
They could have
Like,
done better.
all you need is Church of God in Christ Mennonite, congregation, everyone welcome. Good enough. Too many letters on there. It's already bad enough you're trying to fit Church of God in Christ Mennonite on a sign you can read going down the highway.
That has to be a
But
whole
anyway,
nother headache.
yeah, that's a whole nother topic on its own. But yeah, it's interesting to me, despite the things that changed with the church, the permissiveness, as they would call what they do now, the drift we're seeing, it is very apparent. I was amazed in the time span of about 3 years, the difference of the look of people's homes, the way they dress, the stuff they were doing, the pictures they were taking. Like, there are so many things that we just never would have done. And then now it has changed again. And it was interesting to me, even before I had moved away, I remember talking with the staff about, like, I'm concerned with a lot of the stuff that we have going on. Like, why do we allow it? And I never got any clear answers. It was just kind of that I was a rule follower or whatever. I don't know, or I'm just too, what would we call those kind of people? I'm
Discontent.
not discontent. Like, Amanda, help me out. Like, what do we call
Curious.
people who are trying to keep the rules? The rule following people. What did we call them?
Brown nosing. Pious.
No. Well, so like we would say, like, some people, their piety is too strong and they're too interested in holding the doctrines and
Oh
such.
my
And I
God.
myself, like, I'll be clear, like, I am a rule follower about certain things. There comes a point where there is a breaking point. So, like, certain rules, it's like, yeah, well, this is a rule and we have concrete evidence and concrete ways to practice it. Great, I'll do it. But then when it comes down to somebody being sexually assaulted and I'm told, that's not something we should be talking about, you bet I lost it and I said I have no confidence in you anymore. Like there's different things like that. Like I have levels, but anyway, so being told that and then now seeing how things have gone, and it's interesting to me how you can do all of this. It's kind of a mind fuck, but you do all of these changes and you allow this, yet the person who is expelled for those very things and who still isn't in the church, we're going to hold the avoidance against them. And the only way they can come back is to answer the first reacceptance question. Do you believe you were rightfully expelled? The only way is if the church is right. Like, it's interesting how this is prescribed, that no matter what, you were wrong, even if it was an accident and we're misunderstanding, you still have to accept it because it was spirit-led. This is God's decision. We just must have not had great reception, but that's not your problem. It's not our problem. It's the Lord's problem, and you just gotta accept it. That's kind of how they write it.
What did you say? Like the rule follower is like the person who's upholding piety?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be an obedient church member, and I'm gonna cross every jot and tittle because there is no
Billy?
written rule saying I gotta wear black high heels and black belt to church. But if you dare show up with the wrong thing, don't you dare
Oh, so
show
you
up.
have unwritten rules of expectation in the
And
church.
they change. And you know what's interesting? If you are a certain person with more money or a certain social station, it's okay for you. I mean, that's another thing that was interesting to me. Part of the problem without having these things clearly spelled out is there's that ambiguity. Oh, are we going back to another social construct of manipulation and crowd control?
Uh-huh. Because there's an unwritten rule. So if you don't have the right station, if you don't have the right status in the group, and you follow the lead of somebody who has more privilege and more status or higher power in the group, you're going to be having the rules applied to you differently than the person of the higher privilege and status and power.
I don't buy it. I think, Mary,
But
I
I
think
think
you're just bitter because you got into trouble for not,
you know what? Let's be real. I was shunned after I reported the CSA I experienced. That's why I was shunned. That's when I was shunned.
You didn't go off the bandwagon and start doing crazy stuff like braiding your hair into a crown and then just sitting your covering on
I wore
top, or
jeans, Billy. I wore jeans. But I think if the podcast doesn't have a t-shirt, y'all need a t-shirt. It needs to be a little t-shirt that just says upholding the piety.
but
I think you need a t-shirt. You need
I
merch.
so that we've been talking about it. I can assure you we've been talking about, but it's like, what do we do and where do we put it? But you're somebody who could help us, I'm sure, because you have some experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I've recently made some t-shirts.
I
One
saw.
of them is called Jezebels for Justice.
I like it.
And another one says I'm that disobedient person your bishop warned you about. And I
Well,
think I might make one that says I wear jeans. We
but
don't approve of the way she lives. I wear jeans. And for those of you who are listening and don't know, April 10, 2004, my own mother is quoted as saying, "We don't approve of the way she lives. She wears jeans." This is an article published in the Minneapolis Star Tribune,
I saw it.
written by Paul Levy. Yeah, isn't it hilarious? The things people come up with. But I would suspect, like much like what you were talking about there, it's like this outrage of like these arbitrary things that have nothing to do with the issues at hand that you want to talk about or that you want to address. It's this hyper focus on something that has absolutely nothing to do with the crimes that occurred and transpired. Rather than taking accountability, which they have the power to do if they choose to do so, and taking action and steps to protect the most vulnerable in their congregation, or to provide safety for people who have experienced harm because of this ideology or these values that they purport to be holy and moral and good. Rather than doing that, rather than and then examining them and thinking critically about it and understanding how many people they have harmed by upholding those values, rather than doing that, people love to double down because the ends justify the means. And that's where the ends justify the means mentality comes into play. People invoke this thought-stopping cliches, which I think the upholding the piety comment, I think that's very much, it sounds like specific to your group, like this is something y'all would say to yourself, which then invokes cognitive dissonance and allows you to go forth and do what you must because the ends justify the means. And that's how people control people.
Yeah. I think of different songs we would use, and I think the Holdeman Church is very unique in they have libraries of thousands of songs that actually are they oftentimes don't have anything to do with worshiping God at all. They either have to do with social control, or they reveal the deep suffering that people experience, and that's their only way to express it. I don't know, Amanda, can you think of any songs that reflect that? I mean, even within the hymnal. So before the Holdemans ventured out and started creating their own songs, they found ways to curate a collection of songs, even from outside of their church. So like the Christian hymnal, which they still use, I think 1956 was the last edition they published before coming up with the gospel hymns in 2011, I think it was. There are all kinds of interesting songs in there. Some of them are great songs which transcend many different Christian denominations. You know, even one I sang this morning was one that we have in the Christian hymnal. There's others that it's interesting to me, the songs themselves, without the social constructs and context of the Holdeman Church, they have an entirely different meaning. But the Holdens will assign a scripture reference to that song, and in the context of their social constructs, that song takes on a whole different meaning. I'm trying to think of a good example now, but like there's
I
other
have
songs
one.
like that go
Do
there.
they
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Do they sing, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, we shall
Yeah,
come
they have two
rejoicing.
versions of that one.
We did too in school, but we weren't allowed to sing it in church or at weddings or at funerals or any formal gatherings. We weren't even allowed to sing it at the singings. Oh my word,
Well, I tried to
Billy.
get them to let us sing Tread Softly, you know, because how at a Mennonite funeral they'll sing as a family walks in. So I tried to be like, hey, when my grandmother passed away earlier this year, I'm like, let's sing Tread Softly while we walk in.
How'd that work
It
out,
wasn't
Amanda?
popular.
But now
It wasn't popular.
they use it for weddings.
Use
They've been
it.
using it for weddings, and now they're starting that again.
Yes, I know. That was the whole point of why I said, because I mean, it was perfect.
Oh my word. So the chanting is another thing that also allows people to invoke cognitive dissonance, to remove themselves, to give them distance from the issues at hand.
Mm-hmm. I've also noticed there are certain songs which display almost a militaristic resolve to stay together. Songs like We Have an Anchor or Will Your Anchor Hold, those are both songs which take on a certain meaning. They're designed in a march style meter, and it's all about commitment. And the problem with some of those songs is within the context of that church, it takes on a new meaning. And all of the time it comes back to preserving the group, preserving the group, preserving the group, preserving the group above any individual at all costs before all else. And now they not only take and rewrite songs which others wrote for their purposes, but then of course they're writing their own social control songs. And some of them they sound beautiful. They actually musically are very rich and have texture. I studied music in school, and so I find beauty in them. And I think that's why some of those songs are so beloved. Aside from their message, I think so often people don't even hardly absorb the message of some of the things they are singing. Um, Sometimes for a leisurely activity. I mean, about our most fun activity, at least for me, was always singing. Even now, I still sing, and I still sing some of the cult songs. I just deconstruct them, or sometimes some of them I've actually done some rewriting to make them better, because there's
Oh,
nothing better than taking that power back. But
I love
but
this.
yeah, it's interesting to me how even some of those songs, they help you hold those constructs. I can't
Mhm.
remember which song it is at the moment, but I remember the day I made my mother so upset that she said she never wanted to talk to me again, and I had left her, and I was like an hour away from home and drove home. And the first thing I did is I had this old church bench in my living room at the time. And of course, I used the songbook racks to keep hymnals in. And I pulled out my Christian hymnal and I sat there and I was just paging through and singing, because that's what I do when I'm frustrated. And, and now looking back, it's like, holy crap, here I go. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm going to pull out our songbook and find a message to reconfirm myself and coddle myself in this, rather than considering I just basically disowned my mother because she is so stubborn and unwilling to submit to the church and some other, some of that stuff. And I just, looking back now, I'm really disappointed, but I also have given myself the grace to recognize I didn't know any better. But at the same time, I just look at all of these ways that control is brought on you, whether it's through filters or the approved book lists or where you can buy books. And it's not as though people don't go out and buy books on their own, especially people who don't live in the Mecca and around Mound Ridge, Kansas. They consume a lot of things a lot easier. There's a lot of congregations where I'm sure nobody even has a filter on their phone. But that doesn't stop. I mean, those aren't the ends, because here's the thing. We know that no amount of information out there is going to corrupt them in such a way as to disobey the church without some profound, deep meaning reaching in. Just random bits of information that people are seeking, who still look at it through that lens. There comes a point where they're there. I went to college and had access to whatever I wanted in the world, but it didn't make any difference. I didn't even have the first thought until like 8 years later. Um, and it's because of just the deep indoctrination of it all. And maybe that's not the same for everybody. I don't want to be exclusive about that, but you see it. I mean, how many of these youngsters go on and are on Instagram and putting pictures up every day and doing all kinds of stuff?
Well,
And they're not going to leave the church. A lot of them, they will not leave. They will do everything they can to stay with it because there's
think,
something else at work.
think about this though, Billy. You're talking about a group that has taught you, that has groomed you. And for me, it was like I was taught this from birth. It's like this is the information that is correct because the church has deemed it correct. And if we go seek out outside information, like we could read the Reader's Digest, but we have to remember those poor worldly people.
Mm.
So even if you access other information, are you allowed to actually fully digest it psychologically without dismantling that belief that the church is the one true church? If your church is the one true church and the real church, I challenge you to critically examine every single thing that your church has taught you to believe in about treating people with love and compassion. And I'm not talking about church approved content. I'm talking about it should stand up to research. It should stand up to what we now know about trauma and how we can better serve trauma survivors. It should stand up to being examined critically and asking questions about it. If your doctrine is true, it should stand up.
So you're saying that truth even transcends religion. Like, something is true, it's true, it's true, and it's just simply true.
Trauma is trauma is trauma, for example.
So just because I know the Lord, trauma is going to be easier. That's just going to be taken care of. I don't have to worry about healing from that.
Well, research has actually shown that trauma during development can result in what we call arrested development. It can actually change the neurobiological pathways in your brain. I mean, research is always growing and learning, and research, in order to be considered, has to be able to be challenged as well, which is why it's growing. It's why we learn more.
So that's why it seems like there's new information, and these things aren't just eternal. Like, something that someone who died in 1900 decided just kind of stands. Like, we just decided, like, this is the point. Or for some reason 1955 is like, oh, that's the peak of fashion for righteous people, we're gonna stick there. I mean, it's
Well,
interesting to me because, like, when you look at people even now with some of the new things going on, it's still it's interesting because, like, the rules themselves are the same, but, like, how you work around it has changed. But so an interesting point you made that makes me wonder about myself and some other people I know is, we grew up, and just like everyone else, we're born. And it's not a blank slate, because there is a lot of genetic stuff that gets passed down from generation to generation to generation. It's inside. But yet, even with that, we still continue a similar pattern of somebody is born, and we immediately do everything we can to squelch them, make them malleable and moldable, and then make them up into this great church member. Hooray. And then they just
because
kind of
as
keep
church
doing it.
said, it's holy to break the will of the child.
Okay.
Because the
Well,
church said so.
I mean, if John Holdeman says it's right, better hop on the bandwagon while we still can.
I mean, can we just look at like some of the developmental research about how to raise children and how the results, like, just I challenge you to go read some results of different parenting styles, such as authoritarian, authoritative, and permissive, because the best outcomes are going to be authoritative. But don't believe me, go read it for yourself. But I also want to say this is like, people have to be curious. People have to understand that we are shaped by everything that we have experienced in the world, and especially during development, because our brain development doesn't end until we're in our mid-20s. And even then, we can still be what some people refer to as lifelong learners. We can keep looking at, what do we believe? What serves us well? What serves other people well? If something that we're practicing harms other people, we have the option to choose to change that. The ball is in our hands. We get to be in charge of our lives.
Yeah. It's interesting to see what the Holdemans have to say about child training. They have a lot of different ideas, but basically the whole thought for the basis for them needing to train children in this way is that it's a combined effort of teaching and discipline. And here is the goal: it seeks to establish a pattern of unquestioning obedience. Note the command from Proverbs 22:6, you train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old and not depart from blah, blah, blah. It is the child's sacred responsibility, the child's responsibility to obey his parents. And it's the parents' duty to train them to be obedient. So it's not complete unless the fruits of prompt obedience and order become evident in the life of the child. And isn't it so interesting? Kids come to a certain point and it's like, oh, you must have got converted. You're being so obedient. Like, one thing that always really annoyed me is we'd have some youngster up for baptism who's already shaking in their boots because they went through revivals and then finally are like, okay, I finally know the right things. I have a moment where I can say I felt peace. And then they ask them, do you feel like you can love everybody? Do you feel like you obey your parents? And then the kids just like, they get up there and they give this really shallow experience. And it always just made me cringe because these kids have no idea what they're doing. They do not understand what they're saying. And they're just up there saying, well, I felt really guilty after revivals, and I went home and I prayed by my bed and I found peace. And then they're like, "Oh, congregation, you got any questions for this kid?" And it all starts there. It all starts there. At that very moment is where that person absolutely loses all autonomy because they have now been coerced into a decision that now can have eternal consequences because any mess up of that decision, and it's not anything to do with whether you actually disobeyed any doctrines unless it is so extremely apparent, but whether you have obediently followed, as they say, you're training your children to do. And if they fail, even though they made a decision at as young as 9 years old, I saw a 9-year-old get baptized once, and I'm just like, no, the whole point of Anabaptism is that we're waiting until these people can make a decision. Why are we doing this? And then holding them to this and having them come to members meetings where all of this stuff is shared. And, it just goes on and on and on. But it's just when we end up all of that encircled from the very beginning of abuse in the home, mandated by the church, so that way somebody is totally and completely and quickly obedient. And if they dare fail at any point, once they have crossed a certain imaginary line in the sand, that we're going to then get back to our topic of discussion of holding the avoidance against them just to get them to comply. And it's just so interesting how it all comes down to you are proud and stubborn if you don't do this. But at what point have we ever asked, when was all of this actually necessary? When did any of these things become important? What promise in the Bible have we ignored that we think that this is our only way, basically, to save ourselves and our children from hell? Because just as you can imagine, that child is afraid. Their parents who have to get them there. I'm just so thankful that I didn't and will not be raising children in this church, because I can't imagine doing what was done to me as a child. I mean, just the physical aspects of it all and how that all continues now and the effects of it. And sometimes it's almost harder now because I have the language and understanding to know what happened and what's happening to me now and seeing the connections. But back then, most people that are in that church, they have no idea the trauma with which they operate in.
Yep. And it's like this ongoing cycle that keeps repeating itself. And that's why you've created this podcast. And that's why you've been a guest on my podcast. That's why you've done the things you've done to raise awareness, because you see the harm. And you know that if we don't talk about it, if people don't bring their lived experiences to the table and openly discuss what happened, how it happened, and examine the elements of control around it, those things don't exist and they can't be addressed. Because if something isn't a problem, it can't even be addressed.
And let me take this moment to put you and all of our listeners on notice, because here's something that people like Jeanette Harder or the president and all of the cabinet members of Goshen College and Bluffton University, people at Mennonite Central Committee, what are some others? Mennonite Mission Network.
MCUSA.
I mean, how many other organizations, including Church of God in Christ Mennonite and its church organizations, and all of their love affair with the Showalter Foundation and Mennonite Church USA. I mean, all of these disgusting things that are going on. People at the top of these systems are fully aware. I have dedicated many hours of my personal time to give them information, awareness, and opportunities to make change from their positions of power, and they've chosen not to do that. So people people who do that and yet double down and retaliate and try to harm people either through social maneuvers, taking away their job, taking away their home or income, running them down with cars, all of the different things that I have seen
Calling
in my
them
experience.
charismatic cult leaders.
Yes, all of that. Just know that these people are on notice and they've chosen to do nothing. But you know who loses their ability to do nothing? The leader whose people do something. Anyone listening to this podcast, you're now on notice that this is a safe place for you to tell your story, but it's also a warning that anybody listening to this who does come to an understanding of what is better, they are not a safe person, they are not a trusted person, and they are not a good person, and perhaps they're somebody that maybe should be avoided. If they know what the truth is and they're unwilling to accept and enact that truth, or even simply acknowledge what's happening, big warning. And I just want to make that very clear that this is not something new under the sun. This is not a surprise to anybody who is listening, I'm sure. There are people even outside
Right.
of this whole social context that have heard enough information here to have enough to do a little bit of simple research and understand what is happening. When it comes down to it, there are a few people taking extreme control over others for personal gain. And it's not just status within a church group. They have financial gain, they have social gain, they have securities, and they aren't going to lose any
Prestige.
of that. They have prestige.
Prestige.
And what's
Power.
worse is they use their sections of legitimacy to irk over into other areas. And specifically, assimilated Mennonites in particular, both Mennonite Church USA, Mennonite Brethren, and some of their colleagues who weren't quite as liberal in some sense, but still feel like they need to be Mennonite of some kind. All of them that have access to the education and information and know better, and even are capable and able to express what we are saying, yet still continue to enact the same behavior underneath the surface. They are fully on notice that we are aware of their game, and their harm, is only going to continue when people under them are willing to be silent. And unfortunately, they are at a place now where they can cause harm to people, but you have to be willing to endure some suffering to get out of it. I mean, that's just where there is. It is not going to be easy to get out. It doesn't matter what level you are in. Everyone has something to lose when your only acquaintances, family, and friends are part of this group. Even with people who have connections to outside, even people who work in businesses where they talk to all kinds of worldly people, some of them tell me I felt more alone in that than anything because I knew better, but I was too afraid to step out. It will be okay. I mean, when it comes down to it, if you are one of the people that has the avoidance held against you, that brings us kind of full circle to our closing section of what do I do now? I'm experiencing this, or I am being forced to express this avoidance on people in my community, whether it's Church of God in Christ Mennonite or something adjacent. And let's not forget, especially those people that live out east where we've got a lot of mixes of Mennonites going on. And it's not like South Central Kansas where all of them specifically settle away from the Holdemans. But what about those ones out east that are intermingled that see that? There are so many people who could access this information and find it useful, because the reality is there's some simple points that I think are valuable to anybody as they consider it. And you have to consider, what does it mean for the truth? What does it mean for yourself? But what does your silence also mean to others who are in a position of less privilege? Because there is a varying degree. I myself, even though I had a lot of things that diminished my social station within that structure, I still had a lot of privilege simply just being a guy, among other things. And so when I think about that, that tells me all of us in our own way, it could be as simple as I say the right thing that breaks that hold over the person that's next down the line from me.
Mhm.
Everybody doing their little part will make a difference.
It will. And I want to also say this because I've personally heard from people who are practicing members of Anabaptist groups. I will not say which groups, but practicing members of Anabaptist groups that were expected to enforce the mandated shunning and for them it really felt like a moral injury. And I would also say that if your church is expecting you to do something, if your group of people is expecting you to do something that is harming you morally because it goes against everything you believe in, you have a decision to make.
You
And
know,
go ahead.
I practiced the avoidance one time at one ball game to one of my, she's a family friend. She was our best friend. She was like a sister. And this girl was yo-yoed inside and out of the church all the time. But anyways, so apparently, but I was 15 before I ever joined the Holdemans. So, okay, this would have been the first time I would have been a member that she would have been expelled then. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna be a dutiful little Mennonite. I'm gonna hold the avoidance. She came to a ball game, and I was like, why is she even coming to this ball game? She knows she's not supposed to be. But anyways, and I held the avoidance that night. Like I remember not really talking to her and kind of really being uncomfortable when she came around. And I thought, this is the stupidest thing. I went home and I'm like, I am never doing this again. She is my friend. And she didn't do anything wrong. She doesn't want to be part of this religion or whatever it is she was doing. You know, I wasn't going to do that. And I never, ever, ever did it again because it did not feel right. It did not feel godly. So I stopped. I never did it again. But that was my one time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Like that like totally goes with what I was talking about. It felt like you were morally injured, didn't it?
Yes, it was horrible. Yes, I had wronged myself because that is not who I was in my spirit.
Mhm.
I think it's kind of hard to say this now in a way, but I've had times where I recognized that action is right. I mean, I was behind it. I think part of it was a lack of understanding, but also um, a delicate brainwashing too. I mean, there was a lot, but there came a point where something clicked where I realized that it's like, well, this isn't being enforced in a way that I mean, when it comes down to it, it really, according to the biblical prescriptions that are involved, although loose, it's usually a justice matter. Because if something is right or wrong, it's either just or unjust, typically. Yet we were taught that justice is not God's way, mercy is God's way, but there are ways which that must be bought and earned. And they would say you can't be bought and earned, but it must be bought and earned. And so, like that old song, justice called, but mercy answered. Terrible, terrible, because the reality is somebody being harmed by sexual assault is not a matter of mercy and, oh, that victim and the perpetrator are both victims. Yes, they are. Yes, that is true. However, that doesn't mean that somebody doesn't deserve consequences. It doesn't mean that healing won't take place if there are consequences. And it doesn't mean that forgiveness has anything to do with any of that. It's so much deeper than that. And when we go around just saying you have too strong a sense of justice, and then we go treat people in this unjust way, it's ass backwards. I'm sorry. I just can't buy
Well,
it anymore.
well, and the whole language of like talking about that as if like, well, both people are victims. That's classic Darbo. They deny this. They reverse the roles of victim and offender, and that often plays out in when people enact shunning against people who happen to report crimes that they experience to outside worldly aliens. Because how dare we report that? That is going against God's will. The church will handle the matter. It's a church matter. Don't keep it to yourselves.
Yeah. It's like a lot of things. naturally, everyone knows because it was a secret.
Oh, yes. Everybody knows.
No. Well, I I would say I feel like we've gotten a really good overview of this topic, and we've examined it from a lot of angles. We've talked about the implications of both the practice, but also the implications of those on notice who know about the harms of the practice and how they use it and how it could be, how they can respond in their own individual way. Yeah, what else would either of you, I'd say Amanda and Mary both, give your opinions, your last thoughts on it. What what do we where do we go from here?
Well, I would like to actually just bring up one more point to my understanding. And I have family that has a special needs child, so okay. Um, the Holdeman Church closed down the help committee. I don't actually know their real what they were called, okay. But it was a committee that was there to help with like special needs, children,
Yeah.
things like that. Okay. Um, and they were shut down because the ministers felt like they were getting too much outside help from secular therapists, things like that, and that it needed to be, they could counsel with the ministers themselves at their own congregation if they needed help with these children. Well, my sister-in-law, who has a special needs child and is well versed in a lot of therapies, has done a lot of research. That's one of the things she had said is that, I have a voice and I'm going to use it for those people that do not have that voice, that cannot stand, they'll just shrink into the background and say, okay, you're right, we were told to just take it to our staffs, but we know that's not going to work, so we're just not going to do anything at all. And then that home suffers, and all the individuals in that home suffer because they are not allowed to go get the help they need. In my opinion, that is also a form of um shunning. They shunned them from going to get the help they need. They shut them down. They said that, we are the only help you need. You come to us, even though we're not qualified, even though we know nothing about this, we are your only hope.
What kind of education do these ministers have? What kind of education, what qualifications do they have?
Power to the head, or the ego, I'm sorry, power to the ego.
I mean,
But so here's an interesting thing that I think will add a lot of meaning to what Amanda said. I read the minutes because I have friends who are ministers who are willing to share information with me from the closed minutes of the ministers and deacons meeting. They had a special meeting at Lone Tree. I think, it was Lone Tree over this. And in those minutes, I can't remember who said this, but one of the things they said, if the conference care committee, is that what they call them? The conference care
Yes.
committee, the CCC is allowed to continue in this way, we will lose our ability to discipline members of this church. What does that say? I think that says everything I need to know right there. That is what people seeking mental health treatment and care, that says that one, that those people don't deserve it. It says two, that their desire to control these people and their lives is greater than their ability to help people heal. And it says that these people have a spiritual problem, because that is the role of the church staff, is to be concerned about spiritual matters. And they have proven by this statement that these people have a spiritual illness that needs to be dealt with. And I've also heard the words that it's a spiritual problem, not that, psychology is just trying to blame your mother for all of your problems. But what about you? You got yourself here. I'm sorry, but that's not the whole picture. So sorry, I had to interject.
oh, but that's also victim blaming. That is victim blaming people for having disabilities. That is victim blaming people for their station in life, for their status in life, for the encounters, for the experiences that have led them to where they are now. And
But if you receive some of our church help, you better be damn thankful.
you know what? We could have a whole episode talking about church help and being grateful.
Oh, yes.
Appropriately grateful. But I don't think we need to go there today. I do have one more question. Did they, when, how did they treat the children or people with disabilities in the congregation? Did they also shun them? Did they practice the avoidance against them?
I wouldn't say they practice the avoidance, but the way they are treated is not in a way that empowers or engenders skill towards them or gives them responsibility and opportunities to grow and feel normal. In a lot of ways, they're minimized or they're not given tools, like people who are deaf not being given qualified interpreters, beyond somebody with a typewriter sitting next to them typing what's being said from the pulpit. I mean, things like that, or people who have special needs, giving them jobs that are humiliating to them and causing them to, have that as their work. I mean, there's just a lot of things. And I want to say that I did see some cases where people with disabilities were treated well with dignity and respect. But guess who was behind it? The most educated people in the church. And you know who the most educated people are, and also some of the most ostracized people are? It's the very educated single nursing professionals at church-run institutions, because they're the only people who have gone to college and have learned enough to know better on how to treat people. Because whether they like it or not, the one profession they've chosen, nursing, gives people a lot of information that leads them to question the church. And it's interesting to see how many of those people are in the church and what happens. I mean, that's a whole nother topic on itself too, but it circles back around to this, and it comes down to, how do we treat our people? How do we treat our people, and who gets what treatment? I mean, that's there. And when we think that holding the avoidance against people is going to be productive in any way that isn't exploiting somebody in some way, we've lost it. We have to be willing to look beyond it. It's a practice which takes more than just throwing out, but it needs to be deconstructed, analyzed, and it needs to be used as an example rather than practice. I think that it's something that we can learn a lot from if we're willing to take it, set it aside, and use it as a launch point for something new. Because the reality is, there are a lot of good things that are coming about within the Holdeman Church, and there's a lot of things that should and can come about. I do think that ultimately they will mean the end of the church as we know it. And and while there are many beautiful and good things about the church that may also, with these changes, go away, a very good minister friend of mine said, by being a more inclusive space and accepting more people and understanding more things and learning new information and thus um, exercising in new ways of practice, it's okay to grieve those things which, although they were harmful to others, they did create enjoyment for you. Listen to your memories, enjoy them, recognize what happened and that it's better we've done it, and just grieve the loss of those things, because the reality is the growth and benefit and value which we would have now compared to then are much outweigh it. Even now, I still miss the food we had. I miss our singing. I miss the simplicity of my life, but it is nothing compared to what I've gained in my understanding and deeper relationships with people. I don't go around with surface relationships with everybody I know anymore, because we have something else to talk about than what somebody did wrong and what the church wanted me to do today.
Very well said. And congratulations for your newfound freedom and your deeper relationships, because that is a very common thing of only having surface relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And you were saying the great things about it's a community. That's the thing. It's a great thing. That's the beauty of a community. So minus those rules and shunning for not agreeing with somebody and instead reaching out in love, but and the community. It's a group of, and that's you could take the the rules out and allow the people to be who they authentically are and who God created them to authentically be, or, um, instead of trying to make them all fit into a shoebox, a certain
Yeah.
mold of what you think they should be or should look like.
Yeah. Because it's not the people, it's the system. Every I'm not going to say everyone, because there are some bad apples in that church. I will tell you a lot of the reason things go is because there are some evil people in there. I've met some of them. But most of the people, they transcend what this church system does. I can't tell you the number of people who I saw a couple weekends ago, and just the joy in seeing them and experiencing them. And I also remember the people who I could feel the vibes. There is something wrong going on there. There is something that's not right. And it's interesting who those people are and what their station was within the church. And it was also interesting to me how they weren't all the same level, because there's different levels of membership. There really is. They wouldn't accept that, but there are. And it's interesting to me that the goodness of people transcends the situation they found themselves in. Good people are just good people, and they're going to fall in a different variety of ways, because most of us, we didn't get to choose where we landed. But if you are one of those good people, even if you are too afraid to break out of the system, do what you can to just make everyone's life better within. You don't have to leave the church to find meaning and growth either. I mean, that's another reality, and that's something that everyone should consider too, is some people, they're not meant to leave the church either. Some people are meant to do some work within. Some people, they're meant to just quietly live how they are, and that's the choice they've made, and that's okay too. When it comes down to it, we're all just accountable on our own, and we all have a responsibility, I would say, beyond all of this, to treat each other well. And there are people in there, they're doing that, and they're doing amazing things. And they're really inspiring to me, because there's a part of me that wishes I could have done more from within,
Mhm.
but it just wasn't for me to keep on with. So I just tell people, wherever your station is in life, if you want to pattern your life after the next lady that dies at a funeral, and you feel good about that, and that's your place as a lady who's in this church, great. If you're a guy who wants to continue having your business, and leaving the church is going to ruin it, but you're happy to continue on and try to do your best, and you interact with all of these worldly people, and you make a good example for what the church really ought to be, good for you. Everyone has an opportunity to do what's right where they are. And so I think this arrests any concerns that anyone has that we're trying to undermine the church or get people to leave the church, because that's not what it's about either. It's about individual growth, it's about information, it's about knowledge, and it's ultimately giving people choice, because they deserve that.
I wouldn't even say it's just about individual growth, Billy, but you said that very, very well. But I would also say that it's about communal growth, because when people
Mm.
grow individually, the end result is that when you get lots of people growing individually as part of a community, then the community grows.
It'll have to.
Yeah. Change has to come, though. It has to.
I'd say we've met a really good way here. I think that's a good way to wrap up. Thank you so much for coming on and
Thank you.
sharing your perspective, because we've talked about, it's like, we need some people who have a little bit more. I think too, one thing we've talked about is, like, we need to get some more perspectives on all of this from people who haven't lived it, who might be surprised by what they learned, because I think that's also a point with which we might start raising some eyebrows, and things in the greater world might cause some growing up to happen. I think that's another thing I see more of. And it's my life's mission that I tell somebody new every day. And that's one benefit of moving to a city. I can tell somebody new every day that Mennonites and Amish people are not as wonderful as they appear to be.
You know what, Billy? Like, I just want to say this. Like, I have found, and if you're struggling with hearing this content and you are part of the Holdeman Church, I would invite you to go find podcasts about shunning from Jehovah's Witnesses, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. Talk to people who are ex-Mormons, ex-LDS people. Talk to people about their experiences. And when you get that uncomfortable feeling inside, rather than going and pulling out your songbook, like Billy did, and starting singing, listen to hear. Understand how it affected them.
Mhm.
And understand how many families mandated shunning has torn apart. And
I
then
think you'll hear some echoes.
just examine what your church is doing and how your church perhaps might do better and what your role in that can be. Because if you're part of an organization, you belong to that organization with all of its theology and all of its ideology. And you are upholding the values that it is enacting right now and engaging in mandated shunning that tears apart people, tears apart families and communities, and it causes people to die by suicide. So maybe it's time to go through the fire, to feel the uncomfortableness, and to hear people when they talk to you about the harms that are caused by mandated shunning. And thank you. Thank you both so much for this conversation.
Thank you for listening. It is an honor to connect with our guests, and we wish the best for them as well as our listeners. Remember to like and subscribe for more episodes. Our People can be found on all major podcast platforms as well as YouTube. If you are interested in sharing your story, please contact us at ourpeoplepodcastteam@gmail.com. Thank you.